What happens when you spend hundreds of years marrying your cousins to keep wealth and power in the family? You end up with kings who can barely speak, queens whose children bleed to death from paper cuts, and emperors so genetically fragile they can hardly function as human beings. European royalty didn't just rule with iron fists. They ruled with twisted spines, deformed jaws, and blood that refused to clot. Their obsession with pure bloodlines created some of the most disturbing medical conditions in history. These weren't just minor quirks or strange curiosities. They were genetic disasters that toppled empires and altered the course of world events. From the Habsburg dynasty's grotesque facial deformities to Queen Victoria's genetic curse that spread hemophilia across European royal families, these examples show what happens when human genetics are treated like a medieval breeding experiment. The consequences were so catastrophic that modern scientists still study their DNA to understand just how much can go wrong when you limit your dating pool to your immediate family tree. Let's start with the infamous Habsburg jaw. Meet Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched King, but really, he was the ultimate product of centuries of royal inbreeding. After 16 generations of cousin marriages, Spain's royal family created someone who barely qualified as human. Charles couldn't chew food properly. His oversized lower jaw jutted so far forward that his teeth never met. Court servants had to pre-chew his meals into mush, and even then he often choked. The king of one of the world's largest empires couldn't perform one of the most basic human functions, eating. But the jaw was only the beginning. Charles drooled constantly because his tongue couldn't fit in his mouth, and his speech was an incomprehensible mumble that even ministers struggled to understand. During crucial meetings, diplomats often needed interpreters just to know what he was saying. His mental capacity never progressed beyond that of a child. Court records describe a man who played with toys during official meetings, threw tantrums when contradicted, and made political decisions based on which advisors were the most entertaining. Foreign diplomats reported meeting a man who giggled at inappropriate moments and seemed genuinely confused about why people kept calling him Your Majesty. Charles's sexual life was equally disastrous. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but both marriages were childless. Court physicians documented his complete impotence and tried everything from blessed oils and prayer sessions to hiring witches, believing he was cursed. His chronic health problems were extreme. Seizures, severe immune deficiencies, and gastrointestinal issues made public appearances a nightmare. Servants had to constantly manage the fallout, cleaning up after him and keeping him alive. When Charles died in 1700 at the age of 38, an autopsy revealed a true genetic catastrophe. A peppercorn-sized heart, blackened and corroded lungs, rotting kidneys, and a single shriveled testicle. Royal physicians marveled that he survived as long as he did. His death didn't just mark a personal tragedy. It triggered the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping European politics. But the real tragedy is that this disaster was entirely predictable. The Habsburgs had spent centuries systematically eliminating genetic diversity from their family, creating a literal genetic noose that eventually strangled their dynasty. Then there's Queen Victoria, the so-called grandmother of Europe, whose seemingly harmless presence masked a hidden genetic time bomb. Hemophilia B, a blood-clotting disorder that made even minor injuries life-threatening. Victoria was a carrier without symptoms, but she unknowingly passed the gene to her children. Her sons had a 50% chance of being affected, while her daughters could silently carry and pass it on. Through strategic marriages, Victoria inadvertently spread hemophilia across Europe. Her daughters introduced it to Germany, Spain, and the British royal line, turning her offspring into unwitting carriers of a deadly genetic curse. Royal physicians were baffled. Hemophilia was so rare that most doctors had never seen it, and medieval treatments like bloodletting made matters worse. Families had to cover up the effects, staging portraits to hide bruises and scripting public appearances to avoid risk. Prince Leopold, Victoria's son, lived in constant fear of injury, padded and protected at all times. The disease could skip generations, making it unpredictable and devastating. By 1920, hemophilia had spread through Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain like a silent plague, weakening royal bloodlines at a time when strength was crucial. Even more than physical deformities or bleeding disorders, these genetic problems created political and social consequences. Victoria's innocent-looking genes became tools of unintentional biological warfare, reshaping European power dynamics for generations. The Romanovs of Russia showed just how far genetic misfortune could go. In 1904, the long-awaited male heir, Alexei Romanov, was born to Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. At first, it seemed like a cause for celebration, but within months, their joy turned into terror. Alexei inherited Victoria's bleeding curse, hemophilia, and his condition became Russia's most closely guarded state secret. Alexei's bleeding episodes were horrific. Internal hemorrhages would make his joints swell painfully, transforming his knees and elbows into grotesque balloons of trapped blood. The boy screamed in agony for days, his parents watching helplessly as they tried every remedy available. The Romanovs went to extreme lengths to hide his condition. Official photos were staged to conceal bruises. Public appearances were carefully choreographed, and servants were stationed nearby to catch him if he stumbled. Alexei, the future Tsar, was essentially a prisoner in his own palace, held hostage by his own blood. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian mystic who claimed he could stop Alexei's bleeding. Whether through hypnosis, stress reduction, or luck, Rasputin seemed to have a miraculous effect. This gave a drunken peasant unprecedented influence over the family that ruled 150 million people. The Tsar and Tsarina, desperate to save their son, allowed him access to state secrets, political appointments, and essentially permitted him to operate as an unofficial co-ruler. Rasputin's presence scandalized Russian society. His erratic behavior, sexual exploits, and manipulation of the royal family painted the monarchy as weak, corrupt, and controlled by dark forces. Meanwhile, the secrecy surrounding Alexei's condition fueled conspiracy theories. People saw a government dominated by a mysterious holy man and an heir who barely left his chambers. During World War I, this perception of incompetence and weakness contributed to the revolution. In 1917, the Romanovs were overthrown, and by July 1918, Alexei, his parents, and his 4 sisters were executed, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. The tragedy of Alexei is compounded by modern science. His hemophilia could have been treated easily today with clotting factor injections. What was once a rare genetic disease became a catalyst for political collapse and a revolution that changed the world. Meanwhile, In Britain, King George III earned the nickname Mad King George, and not without reason. His so-called insanity was rooted in genetics, likely a condition called acute intermittent porphyria. This metabolic disorder literally turns the body's own chemistry into poison. During attacks, victims experience excruciating abdominal pain, muscle weakness so severe they can't lift their arms, and neurological symptoms including hallucinations, paranoia, and personality changes. Even the color of urine can turn deep red or purple, a shocking visual reminder of the body betraying itself. George's attacks came at the worst possible times. His first major episode in 1765 coincided with rising tensions in the American colonies. During flare-ups, he became irrational and uncooperative, sometimes detaching entirely from reality. In 1788, one episode left him believing London was flooded, attempting to attack his son, and conversing with the dead. Ministers debated whether to declare him permanently insane and appoint a regent. These episodes contributed to political instability, affecting the American Revolution, British governance, and even Napoleonic-era diplomacy. What's striking is that George's porphyria was likely inherited from centuries of royal inbreeding. The same obsession with pure blood that created the Habsburg jaw and spread hemophilia now concentrated rare metabolic disorders in another royal line. Genetic isolation didn't just produce physical deformities. It could turn rulers into ineffective or dangerous leaders, with consequences that rippled across continents. The Portuguese royal family provides another example of the mental consequences of inbreeding. Queen Maria I of Portugal, known as Mad Maria, began her reign in 1777 as a capable ruler. By 1786, however, she had descended into profound madness. Her religious mania convinced her every minor sin would bring divine punishment. She spent days praying, refusing to eat or sleep, and terrified that demons would drag her soul to hell. Maria's breakdown wasn't isolated. Mental illness ran through the Portuguese royal family like a genetic curse. Her son Prince José suffered severe depression and paranoia, while her grandson, King Miguel, displayed violent mood swings and irrational behavior. Years of intermarriage with Spanish royals, themselves genetically compromised, created a feedback loop amplifying mental instability across generations. Maria's madness paralyzed the court. Important documents went unsigned, council meetings were interrupted by her religious rants, and foreign ambassadors described the court as a madhouse. The consequences were not just personal, they were political. Portugal's instability during the Napoleonic Wars weakened its international position and contributed to the loss of Brazil, its most valuable colony. The Portuguese royal madness revealed a critical insight. Genetic isolation doesn't only deform bodies, it can devastate minds, destroying a nation's ability to govern effectively. By the 20th century, European royalty quietly abandoned the obsession with pure blood. After centuries of hemophilia, madness, and physical deformities, marrying outside the immediate family became a matter of survival. Modern genetics now allows us to understand the catastrophic consequences of those centuries of intermarriage. The story of European royal genetic disasters isn't just about physical deformities or bleeding disorders. It's about how obsession with pure blood could devastate entire dynasties. By the time the 20th century arrived, the consequences of centuries of inbreeding had left Europe with kings, queens, and heirs, whose bodies and minds were compromised in ways that reshaped history. After the Portuguese and British examples, it's clear how dangerously isolation could accumulate over generations. While the Habsburgs struggled with grotesque jaws and Charles II of Spain could barely eat, the Romanovs' hemophilia plunged Russia into political chaos. King George III's porphyria destabilized Britain during crucial moments, and Queen Maria of Portugal's madness paralyzed her government. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were systemic failures caused by treating human genetics as a tool for political consolidation. The broader lesson is chilling. When rulers prioritize bloodline purity over genetic health, they invite disaster. In the case of hemophilia, a single gene carried by Victoria became a continent-wide epidemic, bleeding into multiple royal families and creating crises that governments couldn't handle. Alexei Romanov's suffering wasn't merely personal. It altered Russian politics, gave Rasputin unprecedented influence, and helped spark a revolution that toppled an empire. Even seemingly minor genetic issues could have massive geopolitical consequences. King George III's porphyria didn't just ruin his health. It affected diplomacy, colonial management, and war strategy. His erratic behavior fueled instability in Europe and contributed indirectly to the American Revolution. A single metabolic disorder, concentrated by centuries of intermarriage, became a global historical factor, and mental illness, often overlooked in history books, proved just as catastrophic as physical deformities. Queen Maria of Portugal's religious mania demonstrates how genetic isolation could fracture entire governments. Her paranoia and breakdown made Portugal vulnerable internationally, weakening its influence and causing the loss of valuable colonies. The psychological toll of inbreeding could ripple outward, impacting societies, economies, and empires, not just individual rulers. By examining these royal catastrophes collectively, it becomes clear that the obsession with blood purity was less about tradition and more about control, and the cost was astronomical. Thousands of lives were affected, political structures were destabilized, and in many cases, entire nations paid the price for private genetic obsessions. Hemophilia, porphyria, jaw deformities, and psychological breakdowns weren't just personal tragedies. They were historical turning points, shaping wars, revolutions, and the collapse of dynasties. By the early 20th century, survival forced a reckoning. Royal families, finally witnessing the cumulative devastation of centuries of intermarriage, began to marry outside their immediate circles. Marriages based on political convenience gave way to choices influenced by genetic health, a quiet but significant revolution. Science had caught up with tradition. Modern genetics provided insight into what centuries of observation had shown empirically. Isolation and obsession with pure bloodlines would no longer be tolerated if the survival of a family, and sometimes a nation, depended on it. The age of royal genetic disasters left a grim legacy. Habsburg jaws, hemophiliac princes, mad queens, and psychologically broken monarchs remind us that concentrating power and genes in the same family line carries enormous risks. These weren't anomalies. They were predictable consequences of treating human heredity like a medieval experiment. And the consequences weren't just private tragedies. They reshaped the course of history, from the collapse of empires to revolutions and lost colonies. In the end, European royalty learned their lessons the hard way. They abandoned centuries of bloodline obsession, quietly embracing genetic diversity without fanfare. Yet the stories of Charles II, Alexei Romanov, George III, and Queen Maria remain stark warnings. They show us what happens when ambition, pride, and fear of dilution collide with the unforgiving laws of biology. So, the next time you hear about a royal scandal or a historical disaster, remember, sometimes the most dangerous adversary isn't a foreign army or political rival. It's the family you're born into. European history is full of cautionary tales where bloodlines determined fates not just for monarchs, but for nations themselves. If you want to dive deeper into history's darkest genetic secrets and explore more royal disasters that shaped the world, hit subscribe and let me know which dynasty you want to uncover next. The stories are horrifying, fascinating, and a stark reminder that power and genetics don't always mix well.